Hello, and welcome to Inside the Vault. My name is Sandy Trenholm, and I'm the Collection Director for the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And tonight, we're going to be talking about the Texas Declaration of Independence with Professor H.W. Brands from the University of Texas in Austin. And we're really excited about tonight's program. Professor Brands is amazing to talk to. But before we get started with that, I'm going to introduce you to Allison Kraft, who's our assistant curator, and she's going to tell you how to participate this evening. So, Allison.
Thank you so much, Sandy. So if there's a question that you have for Professor Brands, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll be asking questions at the end of the program tonight, so don't hang on to them, ask them. We'll be gathering them throughout. For everyone's safety, security, and privacy, your cameras are turned off and the chat has been disabled. If you want to talk to us, again, use that Q&A feature. I am right now enabling closed captioning. If you do not wish to have that on, at the bottom of your screen, click that little CC button, and there's a little caret next to it, and it'll turn it off if you don't want to have that on your screen. But when you ask us those Q&A questions, please let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you're an educator, a student, a lover of history, we like to know who is viewing our program and where you're from.
Absolutely. And thank you, Allison. Also on the back end is our intern, Madison. She is helping answer questions in the Q&A and popping things in the chat. So if you see messages from her, she is on our team. And with that, Professor Brands, I'm going to turn it over to you for us to learn more about this event.
Well, thanks, Sandy, and thanks, Allison. Thank you to all of you for tuning in tonight. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you might happen to be. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak to you, in part because as somebody who teaches regularly, I'm teaching at the University of Texas this semester as usual. I really value people who don't have to be in my class or don't have to be tuned in for this lecture. You know, as well as I do, that volunteer students are much better students. They're much more inclined to pay attention. They're much more inclined to engage in questions and the like than the students who have to be there. Now, I make a point at the University of Texas in teaching what amounts to a required class in American history. I consider it something of a challenge to try to then engage the students, most of whom are going to go off and major in engineering or chemistry or physics or something like that. But you didn't have to do this. You chose to be here. And so I appreciate that. The other thing I appreciate about everything that Gilder Lehrman does is its orientation toward teachers. I taught high school for 10 years before I started teaching in college. And so I still feel an affinity toward classroom teachers. I can tell you that the time I spent teaching high school students was in many ways the most fulfilling teaching time of my career. And I'm sure this will resonate with many of you, that when you teach high school kids, and I taught in a fairly small school, so I would teach students in 9th grade, and then very often I would follow the same students through 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade through their graduation. And when commencement exercises would be held in the spring of their senior year and they'd be graduating, I'd reflect on the fact that I had seen them enter school essentially as children, 14 years old, they're just kids. And they're graduating, and many of them are sort of street legal as adults. I think it's probably fair to say that there is no 4-year period in any human's life where such great changes take place as between 14 and 18, the years of high school. And for better, I hoped, and for worse, I hope as little as possible, I had something to do with that. And I confess that every time we'd have commencement exercises, when I was teaching high school, I'd get misty-eyed when the kids would walk up and out they go into the world. Well, anyway, so I appreciate the audience, and I'm going to talk to you about the Texas Declaration of Independence. And this because the folks at Gilder Lehrman asked me to do it. And the reason they asked me to do it is they happen to have an early copy of the Texas Declaration of Independence. So that's why they asked about the Texas Declaration of Independence. The reason they asked me is that some years ago, I wrote a book about the Texas Revolution. And in doing so, I guess I acquired at least a certain reputation as a historian of Texas. Now, I wear that label very lightly because I live in Texas, and I have been in Texas now for 35 years, but I wasn't born here. And so I don't feel like a Texan. In fact, I have concluded that there is a particular moment in anyone's life where you have to be in Texas at that moment in order to get the feeling of a Texan. And it is in 7th grade. And 7th grade is when the Texas middle schools teach Texas history. And I think it's not coincidental that this is about the same time that Catholic kids receive confirmation and Jewish kids are bar and bat mitzvah. It's sort of the coming of age. And like those rituals, it is kind of a conveying of the knowledge you have to have in order to be a Texan. And some of you perhaps are 7th grade teachers. You can appreciate there's a kind of interest that the students of that age can have, but it's a naive interest. And I say that with all charity toward 7th graders. I mean, I'm with 7th graders, but there's a kind of flattening out of what's important and what's not. And so it's very charming that they think that the exact number of people at the Alamo who died in the Alamo is more important than whether the United States was going to intervene in the war with Mexico to secure finally Texas independence. Anyway, so I come to the history of Texas as an outsider. I come as a historian of the United States. And so when I look at Texas independence, when I look at the Texas Declaration of Independence, I'm looking for similarities, I'm looking for parallels, and to some degree differences between this exercise in declaring independence and other exercises in declaring independence. And I'll say more about that later. But the Texas Declaration of Independence is somewhat shorter than the American Declaration of Independence. But as we will see, it's closely modeled on the American Declaration of Independence. And this for a couple of reasons. One is that in 1836, when the Texas Declaration of Independence was adopted, March 2nd to be precise, there weren't that many Declaration of Independences around. You didn't have many models to choose from. There was the American Declaration of Independence, and it was really the first, and it set the standard. There had been nationalist movements, independence movements in other parts of the world, specifically, primarily in other parts of the Americas. And so Mexico declared independence, and Argentina declared independence. And so much of the Spanish Empire in the New World broke apart under the pressure of these nationalist uprisings. And many of those countries had declarations of independence. And they were somewhat modeled on the American Declaration of Independence because they were all couched in the terms of natural rights, the ones that Thomas Jefferson identified, like to right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And there was also this idea that comes straight from the English and Scottish Enlightenment, that people have a right to the government that they want. Now, this was quite a revolutionary idea when it was professed by Jefferson and the signers of the American Declaration of Independence. Before then, you basically took the government you were born into. I mean, most people were born into monarchies or empires, and that's just what it was. The idea that you could create your own, that you could declare your independence and therefore establish a government of your own, a government to your specifications, was something that was new. That was in the 1770s, in 1776. Now, 60 years later, in 1836, it wasn't quite so new, but the ideas were still as revolutionary, and witness the fact that this Declaration of Texas independence was put forward to the world amid the Texas Revolution, as sometimes called the Texas War for Independence, just like with the American Revolution, the American War for Independence. I won't say there's confusion, but there's some debate or blurring. Was it a war for independence? Was it really a revolution? Did it overturn things? The same thing is true regarding Texas as regarding the United States. So more on that, but I got to get us to the Declaration of Independence, and to do that, I have to get us to 1836. Here's a map of Mexican Texas, and it's crucial for our story that Texas be part of Mexico. Now, before Texas was formerly part of Mexico, it was part of New Spain. Mexico achieved independence from Spain in 1821. And so there's a period, lasts only 15 years, where Texas is part of Mexico. Before then, as I say, part of the Spanish Empire. But note the fact on this map, and you can see this a little bit from the fact that to the east of Texas, there are all these states of the United States that are filled in. And the reason that they're filled in, that the lines are drawn, is that they're filling in with people. Between 1800 and 1836, the frontier of the United States was somewhere east of the Mississippi River in 1800. By 1836, it had jumped, well, somewhat out to, well, definitely to the west of the Mississippi River. You can see Missouri, the state kind of in the middle of the map, and then Indian Territory is going to be Arkansas and Oklahoma below that. But the thing to bear in mind is that the eastern part of this map looks busy. It's busy because there are lots of people there. People are immigrating to the United States from other countries. People living in the United States are having children, and the population is increasing. And as the population is increasing, there is increasing demand for more territory. It's crucial to our story that the United States economy in those days was an overwhelmingly agrarian economy. And if you have a growing population, as Thomas Jefferson noted, as Benjamin Franklin noted before him, if you have a growing population, you better have a growing geographical base. Otherwise, farms will get smaller and people will get poorer and poorer. So it was a primary task of American government, it was a primary goal of American society to expand geographically because the American the American population was growing so swiftly. Now, look to the west, that is to the left of Texas in this map. There is this vague line that's out underneath where Oregon is going to be. That's the 42nd parallel. Below that is California, what we called in those days Alta, Upper California, and Baja California, Lower California. But notice there aren't any subdividing lines beneath that. And that's because it is very lightly populated. It had never been heavily populated because most of it is desert or high mountains. And so even before the arrival of Europeans who introduced diseases to which the American Indians were not resistant, there weren't many people there. But then after the arrival of Europeans, when those numbers were dramatically reduced, it became even emptier. So this, I'm not going to say it's a great wasteland, it's a great empty stretch, but it's pretty empty by comparison with lands to the east of Texas. And if you can think of this as, I don't know, gas molecules bouncing around inside a closed container, there's pressure to the east and the pressure is going to find its way to even out as it moves to the west. One other thing to bear in mind, Texas is at the northern frontier of Mexico. It's a long way from the Central Valley of Mexico. And the government of Mexico had never been able to get many people, many Mexicans, to colonize Texas, with the result that in 1821, when our story really begins, is kind of the birth of modern Texas. In 1821, there were perhaps 4,000 Mexican nationals living in Texas. There might have been 30 or 40,000 Native Americans, and there weren't many, I'll call them Americans, I could call them USians or US nationals. There weren't many in Texas at that point, but there were a lot really close by, and that's essential to understanding what comes next. So what comes next is that the government of Mexico, following the example of the government of Spain, decides to invite American colonists to come to Texas. Now, I confess that as somebody who didn't take that 7th grade Texas history class and who was new to Texas history, and also somebody who knew enough about American history to understand how this story played out, I always scratched my head and asked myself, why in the world did the government of Mexico invite Americans into Texas? Because didn't they know that Americans were grasping and that they were growing in population, and anytime they saw a piece of territory they liked, they grabbed it and they made it part of the United States? Didn't the Mexican government understand this was the dynamic it was inviting into Texas? And at first I thought, boy, they just must have been really ignorant of what was going on in the United States, because they didn't read the papers from New York or Boston in Mexico City. So that would explain part of it. But there was actually a deeper reason, a reason that I didn't appreciate until I got to Texas. And going back to the map here, when I was writing my book on Texas, I had a map like this, and I had it taped to the wall above my computer. And I drew 3 arrows on the map. And one arrow went from what's sort of the right side, from up here down toward Texas. It was an arrow coming from the northeast. And this is the arrow of immigration toward Texas from the United States. There was a second arrow that was immigration toward Texas from Mexico, from the center of Mexico. The arrow coming from the United States was a pretty fat arrow, representing a lot of people coming toward Texas. The arrow from Mexico was a skinny arrow and very long, because, as I said, not very many Mexicans were moving to Texas. It was a source of great frustration to the government of Mexico, because they knew they're going to have a hard time hanging on to Texas if there weren't many Mexicans there. There was a third arrow that I really hadn't thought about at all until I studied this, and it was coming from the northwest, from the west and the northwest. And this was an arrow of immigration to Texas as well. But this immigration was armed immigration. This was a military invasion of Texas by the Comanche Indians. And the Comanche Indians were waging depredations against Spanish missions, against Spanish villages, to the point where the Spanish and the Mexicans following them, they despaired that they would lose Texas to the Comanches before they would ever lose it to the Americans. And so they invited the Americans in and say, okay, you come on down and we'll give you land in Texas. And the promise of land was in exchange for the Americans had to agree to fight the Indians. So the Americans were going to be essentially the human shields of Mexican Texas against the Comanches. So they came in under these circumstances. And there were indeed frontier Indian battles between the American colonists and the Comanches and some other tribes as well. But the Americans had gotten used to fighting Indians in Tennessee and in the Ohio Valley. And so the idea of fighting Indians was not a particularly big deal to many of them. In fact, a very large portion of the immigrants to Texas came from Tennessee. And these were contemporaries of Andrew Jackson, who had cut their teeth fighting Indians in that, well, what was called the dark and bloody ground of Kentucky and Tennessee in the early days. Now, it's true they had never encountered anybody quite like the Comanches, these armed warriors. Some people have called them the greatest light cavalry in the military history of the world. And so the Comanches were something they hadn't counted on. But nonetheless, that's the deal. You come to Texas, you get land, and you fight the Indians. So the leader of this movement is Stephen Austin, identified here as the 4th Texas Secretary of State. But in fact, he was the first of what were called the impresarios. These were the go-betweens, the organizers of the colonization. And Austin traveled around the United States, especially the states of the United States relatively close to Texas, Tennessee. He was from Virginia. He took out advertisements in American newspapers, and he was going to attract these American colonists. And the original deal under the original charter was that there were going to be, I don't see the number here right away, but 300 families would come in. And the 300 families would get 300 farms. And the farms were huge by comparison with farms in the United States. For in the United States, a farmer might be lucky to get 160 acres. That's a quarter section. In Texas, they would get a league, which is over 4,000 acres. So these American colonists came to Texas and they thought they'd died and gone to heaven because they had enough property for themselves, for their kids, for their grandkids, and it was free. All they had to do was they had to pay a few sort of filing fees, some bookwork stuff, of which Stephen Austin got a cut. This was the reason that Austin was involved. His father died, leaving him a huge debt. His father was an industrialist who got leverage in over his head, and then the economy collapsed during the War of 1812. And Stephen Austin inherited this heavy debt. And in those days, debt was inheritable. So his father had been in debtor's prison. Stephen Austin could anticipate going to prison himself. And even with that threat hanging over his head, he had to think about this whole idea of going to Texas a little bit. And I imagine him sitting there and he's thinking, Texas, prison, Texas, prison. He had to think about it, but he finally decided to go to Texas. So he was the one who led the American colonization scheme into Texas, into Mexican Texas. And this is crucial for the story because Stephen Austin became a citizen of Mexico. He left the United States imagining that he would never return. He became an expatriate. He moved from the United States to Mexico. And he actually helped write the Mexican Constitution of 1824. And he taught himself Spanish. And he was essentially saying that I am becoming a citizen of Mexico. And this is where I will live the rest of my life. And this is where I will die. And that's a good thing. Now, not everybody thought it was such a good thing. This is Sam Houston. In the Texas state capitol, and in the capital of the United States, there are statues of two Texans who are considered sort of the fathers of modern Texas. Stephen Austin is one, Sam Houston is the other. Stephen Austin went to Texas to become a citizen of Mexico and to make the rest of his life there. Sam Houston went to Texas for a very different reason. Sam Houston had been a real player in the politics of the United States. He was a fan and a supporter of Andrew Jackson. He helped encourage Andrew Jackson to run for president of the United States. Sam Houston was elected governor of Tennessee. And as a young man, he was already talked about as sort of the next Old Hickory. Old Hickory was Andrew Jackson, and young Hickory would be Sam Houston, his protege. But then things went badly wrong. His marriage fell apart. He went on an epic bender for about 3 years in Indian Territory. And in the early 1830s, he came out of his fog and he decided he needed to make something of himself. He needed to win back the respect of Andrew Jackson. He knew that Jackson had his eye on Texas. Jackson was an expansionist. Jackson was looking for more territory to expand into. Every president was the same way because, again, there's this growing American population. So Houston decides, I'm going to go to Texas, and I am going to see about persuading those Americans in Texas that they ought to leave Mexico and join the United States. So the interests, the goals of Sam Houston immediately clashed with those of Stephen Austin. Stephen Austin's whole plan was that Texas would remain part of Mexico. Sam Houston's plan was that Texas would not remain part of Mexico, but would become part of the United States. Now, what Austin had going for him was, well, initially the support of the Mexican government and the support of the early American immigrants to Texas, the ones who came in under this charter, who had their land and the title deeds all secured, and who had made the decision, we're going to become Mexicans. Sam Houston appealed to a different group of American immigrants to Texas. Once the colonization scheme got off the ground, then word came back to the United States that Texas is a pretty good place to live. There's all this land here. There aren't very many people. And the climate's pretty good. Now, it's sometimes, it's hard to persuade my Texas students that the climate in Texas is really good because it's hot during the summer. However, first of all, it wasn't as hot back then as it is now. Cities get hotter than the countryside, but also in those days, before easy heat and air conditioning, winter cold was considered much worse than summer heat. So people went to Texas and they thought, this is great. The land is very fertile. And they wrote letters home and they said, you guys ought to come to Texas too. And a lot of people decided to come to Texas, but not burden themselves with going through the routines. They were essentially undocumented immigrants, illegal immigrants to Mexican Texas. And they came across the border in greater and greater numbers until they enormously outnumbered the Mexican nationals in Texas. And they began to look on Texas as this place that was 75% American. And being Americans of that day, this is the day of the age of manifest destiny. They go, everything ought to become part of the United States. So Houston begins scheming as to how Texas can be made part of the United States. Friction develops between Austin and Houston, between the two of them initially, but then between the two of them and this guy, Antonio López de Santa Anna. He had been a soldier in the Imperial Army of Spain. He became an early Mexican nationalist, first a royalist, but then a Republican. And he was an ambitious man. He was a gifted military leader. And he decided, as many military leaders do, to go into politics. And by the mid-1830s, he was the president and general-in-chief of Mexico. He held the top office in the civil government, civilian government, and in the military chain of command. And Santa Anna looked at those Americans in Texas, Austin, Houston, and he viewed them with grave suspicion, precisely because there were so many of them and they were ignoring Mexican laws. In fact, the Mexican government had sent a committee of investigation to the Texas border with Louisiana, Texas border with the United States. And the conclusion that the general, who's the head of the commission, said is, unless we can get control of our border, we will lose Texas forever. Now, in fact, Mexico never did get control of its border, and various sources of friction arose between the Americans in Texas and the Mexican government. The friction involved such things as, well, part of the deal, I don't think I can find it in the fine print here, but everybody coming to Texas had to be baptized in the Roman Catholic Church if they weren't already Catholic. The second thing the deal was, and this actually became more and more of an issue by the 1830s, they had to give up their slaves. Now, Texas adjoined several slave states in the United States, most notably Louisiana, then what will be Arkansas Territory. And next door, of course, was Mississippi and up there Tennessee. And many of the arrivals from the United States brought their enslaved workers with them. Because slavery was illegal in Texas, they devised various ruses to get around the law. So they would sign a piece of paper that says, I grant freedom to this slave. And then they would require the slave to sign an indentured service contract. And given that many of the enslaved people were illiterate, they didn't know what they were doing, they're sort of compelled to do this, they could kind of get around it that way. The other way they did it was they just banked on the fact that Texas was far from the center of political gravity of Mexico, and there weren't many police. So nobody was really stopping them. Now, by the 1830s, Santa Anna decides that he is going to tighten up on this. The tightening up is not simply about Texas. Politics in Mexico had been in turmoil for most of the period from independence in 1821 until this time. And so Santa Anna decides that the Mexican model of government just isn't working. It was a federation. It was a federation just like the United States. In fact, it was called Estados Unidos de Mexico, so the United States of Mexico. But he thought, this isn't working, so he centralized the government. He especially cracked down on the Texans, first of all, by denying them their state government. So Texas had a state government, but then it was attached to the neighboring state of Coahuila, which would dilute the influence of the Americans. And then by 1835, Santa Anna essentially dissolved the state governments generally, centralizing his authority, which gave the Americans in Texas an excuse, a reason to say, okay, enough is enough, we're out of here. So this is when the Texas Declaration of Independence came out. And so here's the Texas Declaration of Independence. And I said that as a historian of the United States, I was sort of looking for parallels. I was looking for connections to other things in United States history and the history of Texas. And immediately, the Texas Declaration of Independence seemed to me to be positioned between two other declarations. First of all, the U.S. Declaration of Independence. This is 1776. And the U.S. Declaration of Independence says what it says. The United States is going to become independent. And most of you will have some audio memory of the language of the Declaration of Independence. I'll come back to this in a moment. But this is 1776. In 1836, so 60 years later, Texas declares independence. As we'll see, it declares independence on many of the same grounds that Jefferson and the signers of the Declaration of American Independence put forth in complaint against King George. But in the case of the Declaration of Texas Independence, the bogeyman is Santa Anna. So Santa Anna is the stand-in for King George. And then the other document that it's positioned against is secession. Now, this is the secession of South Carolina, the first state to secede in 1860. Texas would secede in 1861, February 1st, 1861. And so from the standpoint of American history, it's the U.S. Declaration of Independence the Texas Declaration of Independence, then the secession of the 11 states who formed the Confederacy. If we want to be specific to Texas history, the Texas Ordinance of Secession is 6 weeks after this one. And so from the Texas standpoint, there it goes, American independence, Texas independence, and then Texas secession, which from the standpoint of Texans and the other states that seceded, it's another form of independence, independence of the United States. So anyway, so that's where I position it. There's one fugitive picture here. So the Texans, they decided they're going to declare their independence. They fight for their independence. They lose at the Battle of the Alamo. That's a big loss. They lose the Battle of Goliad, in which another couple hundred people are massacred. But they win the last battle of the war. This is the aftermath of the Battle of San Jacinto. This is the one that the Texans won. Sam Houston is there lying on his blanket. He's been wounded in the ankle. He got a musket ball to the ankle. Santa Anna has been captured. He was fleeing the scene, but he's been captured and brought back. And so we see that although Houston is the one lying down and Santa Anna is standing up, actually, Houston has the upper hand in this situation. So this is the day, April 21st, that sort of marks the culmination of the Texas War for Independence. It's more complicated than that, but what happens next is, I'll just quickly say, and actually, so let's get to the Texas Declaration of Independence. This is a version that was printed in newspapers shortly thereafter. And here's the text of the Texas Declaration of Independence. When a government has ceased to protect their lives, liberty, and property. Okay, if you catch that, you'll recognize the voice of John Locke as unmodified by Thomas Jefferson. So life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was what Jefferson said. Life, liberty, and property. This is the original version of the Trinity of Rights under the English and Scottish Enlightenment, from whom its legitimate powers are derived. Governments derive their powers from the agreement of the people, and governments are instituted for the happiness of the people. And the deal is, as long as governments conduce to the happiness of the people, then they're legitimate. But when they no longer do so, then it is the right of the people to form governments of their own. And so then we get to the Bill of Particulars against Santa Anna and against the Mexican government. And this is very much like the Bill of Particulars in the American Declaration of Independence. So we get down here to, when a government has ceased to protect the lives, liberty, and property of the people, I was there. Okay, sorry. The Mexican government, by its colonization laws, invited and induced the Anglo-American population of Texas to colonize its wilderness under the pledged faith of a written constitution. Yeah, that part's true enough. And that constitution, in fact, was abrogated by Santa Anna. So this is a fair complaint. Some of the other complaints are a little bit less persuasive. So it has failed and refused to secure on a firm basis right of trial by jury. There wasn't any trial by jury when they came in, so they didn't have any reason to expect that. Maybe they hoped that one day it would show up. It has suffered military commandants to exercise arbitrary acts of oppression and tyranny. Here you can hear echoes of the complaints against the British government, the Quartering Act and such things as that. It is dissolved by force of arms the state Congress of Coahuila and Texas. Now this one is forward-looking because Texans are standing on their state's rights within the Mexican Federation. And Santa Anna has abrogated those states' rights. So there's that. Let's see, next. It is, next one. It is made practical, it denies us the right of worshiping the Almighty according to the dictates of our own conscience. This was never part of the deal. The opposite was the essence of the deal. You come to Mexico, you have to become a Roman Catholic. Many people, like Sam Houston, they were baptized, but then they never bothered to go to church. It was just, okay, this is what we have to do. It has demanded us to deliver up our arms, which are essential to our defense. Now, fans of the Second Amendment in the US Constitution will recognize this. This was, of course, the Second Amendment in the US Constitution comes out of the idea that militia are necessary to the defense of people's liberties. And the Texans are saying exactly the same thing because indeed the Mexican government tried to disarm Texans. And the first battle of the Texas War of Independence, the Texas Revolution, was the Battle of Gonzales, where the Mexicans say, give us back that cannon that we gave you. And then the Texans replied, and they wrote it on the flag, come and take it. And that's when the fighting started. It has, through its emissaries, incited the merciless savage. If you remember from the American Declaration of Independence, that's one of the complaints against King George. This one's overstated, though, because the Americans coming to Texas, they knew the reason they were invited in was to deal with the Indians and the military revolutions and so on. Anyway, so we're therefore forced to the melancholy conclusion that the Mexican people have acquiesced in the destruction of their liberty and so on. And therefore, the people of Texas do now constitute a free, sovereign, and independent republic and are fully vested with the rights and attributes. This is almost taken word for word from Thomas Jefferson in the concluding paragraph of the American Declaration of Independence. So there we are. So I'm going to stop there and let's have a discussion. Let's get some of the questions. So do we have questions, Allison?
There are a lot of questions.
Good.
And I also want to thank people who submitted questions on our website earlier this week. We are going to start with a few of those. So the first question that I'm going to ask comes from Kevin, and Kevin is a teacher in Texas and says, the 13 colonies were never able to get the other English colonies to support them in their fight against England, unlike the Texas Revolution, which was one of numerous rebellions that Mexico was facing during that time. What caused such a difference in how widespread these events were?
Okay, so this is a really good question. In fact, the Texas Revolution, that's more precisely, the Texas revolt against the Mexican government was part and parcel of lots of revolts, originally against Spanish authority, and then against the new groups that spun off from New Spain. So in fact, when Mexico broke up, with Texas being the first part taken away, and then California and New Mexico and Arizona going a little bit later, that was just part of what else was going on. So when Central America launched its revolt against Spanish authority, it came out in a big piece. South America came out in big pieces, and then there were smaller defections from those until you wind up with the number of countries we have today. I should point out that that was one of the reasons that Abraham Lincoln refused to accept the secession of the South, because if the idea of secession takes hold, then instead of one country in North America, there will be at least two. That is the Confederate States of America plus the United States. But the Confederacy will probably break up, and maybe the United States will break up too. So there was definitely a belief in those days that the more countries that inhabit a small area, the more likely you are to have wars. So the question was asked, so first of all, why did Canada not join the United States? And then why, what does that have to say about the Texas experience? So Canada didn't join the United States primarily because the Canadians felt little affinity for what the Americans were up to. Most of the Canadian population was French, and they actually liked the government of the British Empire, which is a big improvement over the French government they had been under until just a decade or two before. And so they had no gripe against the British government. And furthermore, they understood that there was no love lost between the American colonists, I will call them, and the French colonists in Canada, starting with the fact that most of the French were Catholics. And the United States the American colonies at that time, they were overwhelmingly Protestant, and most of those Protestants were really anti-Catholic. So that's why Canada didn't join the United States. But I'm actually going to take the question and turn it in a slightly different direction. Sam Houston was really he was the commanding general of the Texas Army during the Texas Revolution. And Houston knew in a very deep way that Texas would never be able to win independence by itself. It needed help. And the help was going to come not from other parts of Mexico, although there were other states in Mexico that had similar gripes to the Texans. The gripes did not include slavery, for example. They didn't include religion, but they did include the fact that Santa Anna had usurped the authority of the central government and basically dissolved their state government. So there were revolts against the authority of Santa Anna at the same time as the Texas revolt. But Houston understood that the fate of Texas would be determined between the United States and Mexico. And Houston had this secret strategy during the Texas War of Independence to try to sucker Santa Anna into fighting against American troops. Now, Santa Anna was no fool, but Houston knew something that was potentially crucial to this. He knew that the eastern border of Texas was in dispute. And the Mexican government said that the eastern border of Texas is the Sabine River, the boundary with Louisiana. But the American government under Andrew Jackson said that the border between Louisiana, between the United States and Texas, was the Trinity River, which was 80 miles to the east, to the west of that. So there was this disputed strip. So Houston's plan was to retreat into that disputed area, get Santa Anna to follow him there, and then Andrew Jackson would conclude, wait a minute, Mexican forces have invaded the United States, and would go to war against Mexico. Now, it didn't work out because Houston didn't share his secret strategy with the soldiers in the Texas Army, and they were too upset against Santa Anna for the Alamo and the massacre at Goliad, and they said, we're going to fight. The Battle of San Jacinto, which is pictured here, was Houston's victory, but it wasn't his idea. He was forced to fight because his soldiers wouldn't retreat any further. But Houston, in fact, was right. The fate of Texas was really not decided until the United States and Mexico went to war, not in the 1830s, but in the 1840s. Mexico did not surrender its claim to Texas until it went to war with the United States. And strikingly, the trigger of war in the 1840s was very much what Houston had attempted in the 1830s. There was this disputed region on the border of Texas, between Texas and Mexico, between the Rio Grande River and the Rio Nueces, and the Nueces River. And James Polk sent troops into that region, got Mexican forces to come and attack, and then Polk could say, American blood has been shed on American soil. And so it really wasn't until the end of that war that Texas's place in the United States was confirmed. Now, so I'll stop there. Let's get another question.
I lost my mute button there. The next question that we have comes from Robert, who is also in Texas. And Robert says, can you please elaborate on the role that slavery played in creating tensions between the Texan settlers and the Mexican government, and ultimately led to the decision to declare independence?
Yes. So for some of the Americans who immigrated to Texas, slavery was really a big deal. They typically were commercial-sized farmers. They were planters, and they wanted to establish cotton plantations that were going to be run like cotton plantations in Louisiana or Mississippi or Alabama. They would require dozens, scores, in some cases hundreds of enslaved workers. And the business model required slavery. So for that group, slavery was really important, and any threat to slavery would be a threat to their livelihood and their prosperity. There were a lot of American immigrants to Texas who had no slaves whatsoever and had no stake in the slave system. And for them, in fact, they were anywhere from tolerant of slavery to averse to slavery. And this was a common dynamic because if you were a white person and you were going to make your living through your own labor, you didn't want to have to compete with enslaved labor because enslaved labor was always cheaper than your labor. So there were a group of Texans. They tended to be sort of farther from the really black soil of the Brazos Basin. They would move out toward the hill country, and they were opposed to slavery. And then there were another group kind of in the middle. These could be farmers, family farmers, who might have one or two slaves, and it was kind of a toss-up to them because whether their laborers were enslaved labor or free labor and you paid labor, it wasn't that big a deal. So for the group that didn't care that much about slavery, the fact that the Mexican government was trying to tighten down on slavery was not that big a deal. But for that group of large planters, it was essentially life or death to them. And they engaged in a slave trade that was illegal in the United States at the time. It was illegal in Mexico, but because they were dealing with two separate governments, they could usually, the slavers could sort of dodge from one place to the other. And Texas, I might add, was a wonderful place before it became its own republic and then part of the United States. It was a wonderful place for people who were on the run from the law because there were no extradition agreements between Mexico and the United States. And so if you were on the run from the law in Louisiana, for example, as James Bowie was, you'd go over into Texas, across the border into Mexican Texas, and they wouldn't bother you because you hadn't broken any Mexican laws yet. And then if you did break some Mexican laws, you go back into the United States and Mexicans wouldn't be able to follow you. So for the role of slavery in the Texas Revolution, the Texas decision to break from Mexico was, as I say, really important to some people, not so important to others, maybe worked in the other direction for a third group. It's perhaps not surprising that the planters, being wealthy and having access to newspapers and the like, they were overrepresented in the, we'll call it the media of the day. And they eventually had their way. So was the Texas Revolution all about slavery? No, it was partly about slavery. And for some people, that was a really big part of it. But there were a lot of Texans Americans who'd come to Texas and who really took seriously the fact that the government of Santa Anna had changed the rules. I said earlier that Stephen Austin went to Mexican Texas believing he would spend the rest of his life as a Mexican citizen. And Austin was basically the last one to be on board with the idea of Texas independence because he thought, no, I want to be part of Mexico. But Santa Anna threw Austin in jail for a year and a half for supposedly fomenting revolution in Texas. And that's the last thing that Austin had done. By the time Austin got out of the prison in Mexico City, he said, okay, enough with this. It's sort of like the situation in the American Revolution when the British government finally alienated Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was very favorably inclined toward the British government. But when they alienated Benjamin Franklin, then it was all over. And it was sort of, in the case of the American Revolution, the lesson was if the British government was so stupid as to alienate Benjamin Franklin, they deserved to lose the American colonies. If the Mexican government was so foolish as to alienate Stephen Austin, then they deserved to lose Texas.
The next question that we have here comes from Brenda. And Brenda is from Tucson by way of Texas and asks, could you comment on how this course, as presented in most Texas middle schools, can impact how the average Texan might have an idealized, sacred, even naive view to Texas history, and by inference, perhaps the U.S. in general?
I was having this conversation with my college freshmen just yesterday. So what's the point of teaching history to students? And I solicited their views. And one of the purposes that was suggested by a student is to instill patriotism in students. And I acknowledge, I think that is true. I think that's one of the reasons that certainly in college, that in every public university in the state of Texas, students have to fulfill 2 semesters of American history. And it's part so they'll know the way the government runs, but also so they'll come to appreciate the heritage that they've received. And that appreciation often comes across as patriotism. And I would say that now, I told my students, that's not my job as a college teacher. My job is to challenge whatever you think about history. I'm a contrarian by nature, and I'm going to push you to examine your own assumptions. But I acknowledge then, and I will acknowledge now, it's a different thing. Having had personal experience teaching high school kids, so 9 through 12, I realized that part of what we do, part of what teachers do at that age is tell students or share with students sort of what's valuable and worthy in the world, in history, and what's not. And I'm going to say that it's probably even more so for the younger the students get, because 16-year-olds have some sort of moral imagination. And so they can imagine a different world than it was. But for the younger kids, you sort of have to, I think the younger kids, I'm not sure exactly where 7th graders fit in here, but for younger kids generally, they need more guidance as to who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. And so That's a tough one to pull off. And it's actually, I'm going to confess, it's one of the reasons I stopped teaching high school and went to the college level, because I didn't want to be in the business of telling my students, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. And the fact of the matter is that there are no heroes. There are no heroes who are full-time heroes. The people who do heroic things often do sometimes base things or stupid things. And the bad people, they're probably nice to their mothers. So in the real world, it's a mixed bag throughout. But when you're trying to convey a lesson of history, let's say in a 7th grade class, it's pretty hard to get that across. And so you kind of have to make a decision. And this decision gets harder and harder to make the more varied opinions we have about the meaning of the past and what was good from the past and what was bad from the past. And then it kind of, unfortunately, it's become highly politicized. I don't have to tell many of the people watching tonight that the political wars have really they become the history wars. And so how do you deal with this when you have half of the electorate saying that we need to emphasize everything good about American history, so our students will tend to believe that this is the greatest country on earth, and maybe the other half say, well, wait a minute, there's a lot of bad stuff and we need to highlight that. And I don't know where the middle ground is. If I can offer any comfort to teachers, it is that I've watched this go on for 35 years. And the politicians eventually lose their focus. They get distracted and they start picking on some other groups. So this is going to perhaps sound like advice that's not very helpful, but just do what you do and do the best you can with your students. And eventually the politicians will go their own way. I'm afraid I don't have any better and more heartening answer than that.
Allison, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, that sounds good. That's always tough. It's always tough to look at my list of questions and pick just one more.
Because there were a lot of really good questions tonight too.
So many really good questions. Yeah, I will pick one from an individual from Texas. This is Raul, a professor from Texas, who asks, how would you reconcile the March 1836 Declaration of Independence with the September 1836 overwhelming vote to request U.S. annexation?
Okay, so the unspoken assumption in the Texas Declaration of Independence is that this is really not a long-term project. Texas does not want to be independent. Texas wants to be independent of Mexico, but it also wants to be joined, annexed to the United States. Sam Houston went to Texas specifically to break Texas away from Mexico so it could be joined with the United States. And overwhelmingly, the Americans in Texas who supported independence, they did so thinking this is going to lead in short order to annexation to the United States. So there's, on the face of it, there seems to be a contradiction between, okay, in March we want to be independent, and then in September we want to join the United States. But the Texas Declaration of Independence was intended as a stepping stone, and a very quick stepping stone to annexation. But here's where history runs a crooked route. And it's also, I have to say, as somebody who's not from Texas, I have to chuckle sort of every time I think about this, because of course I ask my students, what's special about Texas? First I say, how many of you are Texans? We're born in Texas, grew up in Texas. And I've got a class of 500 students, and probably 450 of them, 420 of them, raise their hand and say they're Texans. Okay, so what's special about Texas? What makes Texas different from the other states of the Union? And of course, the answer is that Texas was an independent country at one time. And yeah, that's true. Now, people in Vermont who remember the Green Mountain Republic, and some Californians who remember the Bear Flag Republic, and maybe some Hawaiians who remember the Kingdom of Hawaii, they might dispute it. But the key of whether you're actually an independent country is whether other countries recognize you. And in fact, other countries did recognize Texas. But the reason I chuckle is that the Texas Republic was not the idea of the Texans. The Texans didn't want there to be a republic. They wanted there to be simply another state, or maybe multiple states, in the United States. But when they applied for admission to the United States said, no. It's like, asking somebody at the prom and they say, no, I don't want to go with you. So the Texans, they got left out in the cold. Now, for 9 years, they had their life as an independent republic. And this is the thing that the Texans, Texans today, later, remember as this is what makes Texas so cool, and Six Flags over Texas and all of that stuff. Well, the thing is, life under the Texas Republic was much worse than life under the Mexican government. It was much worse than life under the American government. The Texas government was broke. It had no money to pay soldiers. Its army was a joke. Its army could not prevent the re-invasion of Texas by Mexican forces. San Antonio, the largest city in Texas, was occupied twice during the 1840s by the Mexican government. The Texas Republic was a basket case. And when finally the US government in 1845 says, okay, we'll let you in, then it was with a sigh of relief that Texas kind of staggers and falls into the arms of the United States. Perhaps I should remind the listeners that the reason that Texas was not allowed into the United States in a timely fashion was everybody knew that if Texas came in, it would come in as a slave state, or worse, it would come in as multiple slave states. So Texas was and is a lot bigger than every other state in the United States, with the exception of Alaska, which is a late arrival. And Texas was so big, it was half the size of the Louisiana Purchase. And it was bigger than the Northwest Territory, which had already been divided up into 5 different states. So the thinking was Texas is going to come in as not just one slave state, but maybe 5 slave states. It was below the line of the Missouri Compromise. And so that would give the South and slaveholders an overwhelming advantage in the Senate. And so the anti-slavery forces in Congress said, forget it, we're not going to allow this to happen. There were enough anti-slavery votes in Congress to prevent the ratification of a treaty, because with just a 1/3 + 1 of the Senate, you can block a treaty. There was a majority in favor of Texas annexation, even with the possibility of more slave states, but they didn't get the 2/3 majority they needed. So the end run that they finally made in 1845 was say, well, we're never going to get a 2/3 majority for a treaty, so we'll concoct this new idea. We'll just admit Texas by a joint resolution that only requires a simple majority in the House and the Senate. And it's still kind of unclear whether that was constitutional or not, but nobody decided to challenge it then, and nobody successfully challenged it since.
Well, thank you for that, Professor Brands. That was amazing. And thank you, Allison, for all those wonderful questions. I can see them coming in, and there were a lot of really, really good ones. So thank you, everyone, for asking that. So Allison, do you want to talk about some of our upcoming programs?
Sure. So our next session of Inside the Vault will be Thursday, October 6th at 7 p.m. We're going to be joined by Michael J. Berkner from Gettysburg College to discuss materials related to Dwight D. Eisenhower's views on Vietnam in 1968. If you are just absolutely itching for more history, because why wouldn't you? History is awesome. Join us on Sunday, the 4th of September at 2 p.m. Eastern, where Keith, and forgive me if this is pronounced incorrectly, Keith Plumers will be discussing his book, No Wood, No Kingdom, Political Ecology in the English Atlantic. There is still time to sign up to be a student in the MA in American History program, a partnership between Gettysburg College and Gilder Lehrman. Registration closes at the end of September. And 2 more things that are not here on this slide. I want to let everyone know that Professor Brand's book, Lone Star Nation, The Epic Story of the Battle for Texas Independence, is in our bookshop. And we have a really fun new addition to our gift shop, puzzles. There are puzzles in the gift shop now. So not only can you see items in the collection, you can also work them as a puzzle. I love puzzles. If you love puzzles, then you'll get a kick out of all of these. They're amazing. There's also things like posters and mugs and tote bags and things as well. So something for everybody, really. So Madison has shared links for all of those things in the chat. Those links, as well as the slide deck and this full program recording and a certificate, if you are an attendee today, are coming to your inbox tomorrow afternoon around 12 p.m. Eastern time. So if you don't have it in your inbox by the end of the day tomorrow, send us an email at collectionprograms@gilderlehrman.org, and we will get all of those things to you. If you're not getting our emails, we send them every Friday after the program that same week. It is possible that your administrative server or something is blocking us. So use a different email account and let us know that you have not been receiving our information. Everything is added to the Inside the Vault archive the following week of the program. So if you missed the email and you want everything else, go to our website. It is all right there.
Yep. And Allison, I'm going to ask for you to add a link to our traveling exhibitions program to the follow-up email. We have traveling exhibitions that can go to schools, libraries, and museums throughout the country. They're panel reproductions, so they can be displayed anywhere, which is fantastic. If you book an exhibition before October 31st, it could be for any time during the next academic school year, but as long as it's signed by October 31st, they're giving 10% off, which is pretty cool. And they have the American Revolution. They have Becoming the United States, which is geared towards upper elementary and lower middle school. Freedom, A History of Us, which is an absolutely fantastic exhibition. I love that one. Immigration and World War I. And we're currently working on a new exhibition on Frederick Douglass, as well as voting rights in American history. So look for those next year. And with that, Professor Brands, we really want to thank you for joining us tonight. And do you have any final thoughts or comments you want to leave the audience with?
Keep doing what you're doing. Teach history is the most exciting subject in the world. And if we can convey that to our students, then they will be able to teach themselves for the rest of their lives.
Yep. And with that, we're going to say good night. Have a wonderful Labor Day weekend. It's hard to believe it's the 1st of September. It's hard to believe summer's over. And congratulations on everybody starting back to school.
Hey, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.